faith.
Having said that, Bill, you may like this next point that he makes. It's rather related to the end of his first point, and that is we evangelicals have failed to pass on to our young people an orthodox form of faith that can take root and survive the secular onslaught. Ironically, the billions of dollars we've spent on youth ministers, Christian music, publishing, and media has produced a culture of young Christians who know next to nothing about their own faith except how they feel.
Yeah, oh, Kevin, and this worries me, I must say, so much. I see these statistics from Barna, for example, about the number of Christian kids who, once they leave high school, leave home, go out to college, never darken the doorway of a church again. They've already lost their faith while in that high school youth group. But so long as they're still under mom and dad's tutelage at home, they continue to go through the motions, they attend the youth group, but once they go off to college, they jettison it, they abandon it. And I do find it bewildering when I think of all of the effort that's been invested in Christian music and worship and Christian activities for young people and all of the sorts of things that we've done to make our churches relevant and attractive to teenagers, that it doesn't seem to be producing the sort of lasting fruit that one would want to expect. And so I do think that we desperately need to disciple high schoolers in the life of the mind, to train them what they believe and to train them how to defend what they believe. So again, that is a problem that he's right about, that we have got to do better on.
He says there are three kinds of evangelical churches today: consumer-driven megachurches, dying churches, and new churches whose future is fragile. Denominations will shrink, even vanish, while fewer and fewer evangelical churches will survive and thrive. Now, he puts a period right there. I don't disagree with the fact that there are many, many consumer-driven mega-churches, so-called seeker churches, seeker-sensitive, seeker-driven churches. There are a bunch of those. Dying churches, there are some denominations, some traditional denominations that are just, their members are evacuating. But then he says, and new churches whose future is fragile.
There isn't any evidence there, is there, that he gives?
Well, I mean, not really.
The dying churches tend not to be the evangelical churches. These tend to be these old mainline denominations that have adopted liberal Protestantism. And those are bleeding members. But it's no wonder, why get up in the dark and the cold on Sunday morning to go to some church service that just preaches a sort of humanism? You don't need God and Christ to be a good humanist and live a decent life. So it's no wonder that those kind of churches are losing members. And I think as these mainline churches have declined, traditional Protestantism has lost its grip on American culture, and American culture has become more secularized. The challenge will be whether this precipitous decline in the mainline denominations can be offset by the growth of evangelical churches, which are becoming increasingly prominent, I think, in our American culture. And there needs to be, somewhere these lines need to cross so that the decline is offset by the increase in evangelical churches. And I simply disagree with him that all of these mega churches are consumer-driven, superficial churches. Some are, but certainly not all of them. And so there, I think he's overly pessimistic. I think that there's hope for the revival of the mind in the church. And I do see this going on, Kevin. I noticed it in this article. He takes no cognizance whatsoever. He seems utterly unaware of the revolution that has been going on in Christian philosophy over the last 40 years, and how this is beginning to trickle down to popular culture in the church through popularizers like Lee Strobel and Ravi Zacharias and others. This intellectual material is beginning to trickle down out of the academy into the man in the pew. And I find tremendous grassroots interest among lay people in our churches in being trained in the defense of the faith. They're hungry for it. They want it. And if this revolution can continue to grow and be fostered, that gives grounds for optimism that this internal collapse that he describes won't happen. But I do think, or I do fear, that it may be a race against time. Will the collapse occur more rapidly than the resurgence in apologetics and doctrine? And I just pray and hope that the latter will grow more rapidly than the collapse occurs.
Me too. I'll give you an observation here, Bill. I see a light at the end of the tunnel. A lot of people are complaining about consumer-driven megachurches and things like that. You know, I've noticed in my observations of looking at these, what used to be called seeker-driven churches. All churches should be seeker-sensitive. Seekers, seek and you shall find. Absolutely, we should be all about seekers. But I think that a lot of these churches, the past 15 years, we have really tried to be more relevant, throw off maybe some baggage that didn't need to be there, and be perhaps a little more what church needs to be to reach out to the world, reach out to the secular world. There's been a growing process in the last 15 years to make sure that all of this consumerism and so on is tempered with worship and with good teaching and so on. So I'm seeing some signs of that.
Some self-correction.
I'm seeing some self-correction.
Yeah.
Now, look,
that
went through
happened at Willow Creek, didn't it?
Of course it did. It really did. And we've had to learn our lesson. See, we went through a transition. Look, guys, we've got to be more relevant. We've got to be more accepting. We've got to welcome people in. We've got to let our own people express themselves in the arts and things. We have a lot of talented people in the pews. Let's put them to work for the glory of God and so on. So I do see a self-correction. And I pray as well that race against time, that correction will continue. He says, despite some very successful developments in the past 25 years, Christian education has not produced a product that can withstand the rising tide of secularism.
Yeah, no, see, that's where I wonder, is he aware of what's happening in Christian philosophy? And or maybe, and now see where I wonder, I have my own self-doubt, Kevin, I think, is the fact that I am so involved in Christian philosophy causing me to be myopic and think that this is a bigger influence than it really is, sort of like holding your thumb right in front of your nose and it looks as big as a skyscraper. Maybe I'm overestimating the impact of Christian philosophy, but I hope not. And my hope is that as this revolution continues, that more and more will impact the secular university with Christian philosophers in all disciplines, and that this will have an increasingly positive leavening effect upon Christian education in our culture. So I'm not sure this fellow's really in touch with what's happening in Christian education.
Okay. And as we wrap up today, just a couple of points, some of his observations as well. For one thing, he expects the emergent church, so-called, that everybody's talking about these days. He does think that will diminish and have a tendency to go away.
I think he's right.
He's not saying this, but I think, and I think that you think, that the emerging church has misdiagnosed the so-called widespread postmodernism, and it's not the bugaboo we thought it was, and they've gone that direction and built a foundation of sand, and then they're so nebulous. We could get into the emerging church, but I'm just telling you that he's saying that they're going to go away. But he hopes that a better evangelicalism will arise. He says, we don't need a bailout. Much of it needs a funeral. He says that our children are not going to be as confident in the Bible as we are. Even in areas where evangelicals imagine themselves strong, like the Bible Belt, we will find a great inability to pass on to our children a vital evangelical confidence in the Bible.
I noticed he seemed to be very much in favor of home churches emerging as the sort of new vital Christianity, which I suspect is, again, just sort of his proclivity personally. I don't see any reason to think that that's going to characterize church life in general in the United States. So I think that it does reflect some of the personal preferences of the author.
It says Michael Spencer is a writer and communicator living and working in a Christian community in Kentucky. He describes himself as a post-evangelical Reformation Christian in search of a Jesus-shaped spirituality, internetmonk.com. So yes, home churches, home cells, Christian community. I think it's an attempt to look more like the book of Acts or the New Testament Christian. Nothing wrong with that. Home churches, some of the churches I've noticed are having a hard time getting people into these home cells as the paradigm kind of shifts toward that. Rather than your traditional Sunday school get-together on Sunday morning in your Sunday school class, home cells are developing. And yet some pastors are saying, well, that's a good New Testament thing, but it disconnects them from the church.
Yeah. I don't see any reason to think that within the wider context of a church group or a church community that you can't have these small groups that add for additional intimacy and connection with a small group of people, but they don't need to be divorced from the larger context. And this larger church will have great advantages to impacting culture and society. I lived in France for some time with my wife, and I have to say, attending these small little insular churches can be tremendously depressing because you don't have things like great music for example, that you will get in a church like we currently attend, where we have a wonderful choir, a full orchestra. I appreciate great music, and you won't have that when you have 8 people sitting around the living room, trying to sing choruses together. You won't have the same talents that can be exercised in the context of a large body. So there are tremendous advantages to being in part of a larger group and then having your smaller, intimate group within the context of the larger group. So while there are certain things that this fellow says that I think are warnings that are definitely to be heeded, good admonitions, I don't think we need to be as pessimistic as he is, nor to necessarily follow all of the advice that he gives.
Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us on Reasonable Faith with William Lane Craig. This podcast is available at reasonablefaith.org, as well as a wealth of audio, video, and written materials from Dr. William Lane Craig, an interactive forum, and a question and answer section that is really popular. People all over the world have benefited from the insights of Dr. Craig, and we invite you to browse our resources at reasonablefaith.org. When you give to Reasonable Faith or purchase our resources, you help us expand into more media and speaking events all over the world. If you appreciate these topics and this ministry, please consider being a part of us with your financial gifts. For more information, go to reasonablefaith.org. I'm Kevin Harris. Join us again for Reasonable Faith with Dr. William Lane Craig.